Welcome to the meeting number 93, the December 2012 meeting. No mistaking that it's December, looking around the room. Maybe the only snow we see anytime soon, so. Yeah.
No, well, not for tomorrow.
Yeah, well, we'll see, I guess. Okay, so we're joined today, obviously, by Chris Hauber, and to my left, Tony Wilkinson, and Elaine Balchinian. And the last time I'll introduce this man as a member of the commission, Bill Bruce.
That's from appreciation, not because we're not.
And Steve Rice, Mike Lyons, nice tie, very nice, very Christmassy. Rick Georgeson, and Don Sapos, also wearing the Christmas tie, and John Brust with no tie.
Let the record reflect.
And at the end, Larry Eckhouse. So we'll first begin by considering the minutes of our September meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review those? Are there any needs for corrections or additions to those? Mike?
I just had one question.
Yeah.
Under item 4 in the reports, where it has the Discovery Center appearance, was it, it says that the members of the public may feel that it looks, the Discovery Center looks unattractive.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if that's was accurate.
Is that accurate, John?
Comment, John, or was it more?
It's more the word inviting.
Uninviting.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We can change that.
Okay.
Because I think the building itself is a very attractive building,
Yep.
and the pine bush itself is very attractive. I don't think that's the only changes I have.
Okay, so in line 3, we'll change unattractive to uninviting. Are there any other
John?
Any other suggestions for change or addition to the meeting minutes? If not, I'll accept the motion to accept them.
So moved. Second.
All in favor of accepting the September minutes as amended, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, that carries unanimously. I don't know if there's anyone from the public who wishes to offer commentary or opinion. Now's the time. No? Okay. We'll move on to the reports. I just have one thing to offer. This is as a result of Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy. Everyone knows that it caused an extreme amount of devastation downstate and in other areas around New York City. That resulted in the generation of a lot of what you may consider construction and demolition debris, just general junk that was generated in an unprecedented amount. So much so that it accumulated in places that normally you would never see garbage or junk, and it was being stored temporarily at various locations around New York City and Long Island so that it could be ultimately moved to a place for proper disposal. It became a real crisis, and the Department of Environmental Conservation actually issued an emergency declaration that gave authority for various actions to be taken in order to deal with that problem. One of the things that we did was to grant an emergency authorization to the town of Colony to allow the town of Colony's landfill to accept more waste on a daily basis than it normally did. And I know that that's been very helpful to the people downstate, and Mike, we appreciate that very much. That was very helpful. And I know that there's going to be a lot more waste that continues to come to Colony. Another thing we did was to grant an emergency authorization to the city of Albany to allow the Albany landfill to accept additional waste. We increased the daily tonnage cap for the Albany landfill. We also expanded the number of hours that it could accept waste, and we opened up waste acceptance to Saturday as well. And I know that the city of Albany has been seeing increased tipping as a result of this as well. Although it seems that more of the waste is going to Colony at this point than to Albany. But at any rate, the emergency authorization has been recently extended to January 14th, and the daily cap now stands at 1,600 tons per day. Formerly it had been, what, 950? No? 1050. So an increase of about 550 tons per day. Albany hasn't come anywhere near 1,600 tons on an ongoing basis since we granted that authorization. But there has been increased tonnage being received at Albany. And as I said, that emergency authorization extends to January 14th. The impact of that action on the Pine Bush Commission is, as we may hear later on during the financial reports from Lisa, that for the year, solid waste disposal at the Albany landfill is below what it was projected. And that's had an impact on revenue for the commission through reduced mitigation fees. And for a short-term basis at least, that will probably cause mitigation fees to be higher than projected. So I don't know if we want to get into that any further when we talk about the financial reports, but we can. That's all I've got in terms of reports at this time. Is there any question about that? Anybody have any issues or questions they want to talk about? Okay, thanks. I have nothing further. I don't know if there's any other commission members that have reports.
I certainly want to point out the entrance work that was done, the new fencing and whatnot. We raised an issue at a board meeting 3 weeks, 4 weeks later. It was taken care of. I know there's more plans for the entranceway to continue to increase foot traffic here in the building and attract more folks and whatnot. So thank you. Looks good.
Yeah,
It looks more inviting.
it looks more inviting. That's right.
Dum-dum.
Thanks, John.
Any other commission members? Thank you, John. Okay, we'll move on to Chris then.
Just a couple of things. I don't know that Lisa Anthony, our Director of Finance and Operations, will get into this in her financial report, but I wanted to point out that last week we completed our 5th audit of the year from the Department of Labor. Our first audit was our own internal audit with Wojcicki and Company, looking at our operations from the past fiscal year. Second one was the New York State Insurance Fund. Third one was New York State Insurance Rating Board. Fourth one was the Office of State Comptroller's desk audit, and then the 5th was from the Department of Labor. So this is the year of audits, and it's primarily because, if I had to guess, and in talking to people, because 2011 calendar year was our first year as an entity where we functioned on our own. We do our own contracts. We had no other affiliated entity, so we popped up on the radar. But I want to thank Lisa and Margie, our office manager too, for working through these audits. A lot of effort was put into them, and they've all come back very clean, which they should, but that's good. So, thanks, Lisa. Just an update on citizen member appointments. I had a conversation with a person at the central office of DEC, and it looks like there's an expectation that commission boards like this one, the appointed members are going to be put through the process and through the appointments office, the governor's appointments office, early in the session, which starts at the end of January 2013, because it requires a Senate confirmation of the governor's recommendation. So I have to follow up with that next week with the appointments office, but it looks like those will move through. So I wanted to update on that because Harvey Alexander has asked that I provide an update. It looks like they're finally moving through, so that's good.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Remember last spring we were supposed to go through some training and it was only offered 2 dates?
Yeah.
And some of us couldn't make it.
That's right.
And then there hasn't been any word about that. Do you have any further information?
No, that's a good question because it reminded me with Bill Bruce, this being his last meeting representing the city, Mike Yevely, who's the Commissioner of Planning and Economic Development for the city, he'll be joining us to represent the mayor on the board. And I have a list of things that I have to go and look up, and one of those is the training that he's going to have to go through. so I'll let you know. I'll look it up. No, I mean, it was only,
It's only 2 days.
there are only 2 dates offered, and they haven't offered them again to the ABO. Well, I'll check on that.
I'm sure Mike has already done
Yeah, you're probably right,
it.
because...
Because we all did it for the city IDA.
Right, because the IDA is a... Okay, well, I'll check. ABO training. And I won't go through anything specifically in the green update in your board packet. Some of that will be covered by Jeff Fulmer when he does the Discovery Center update. But I'd like you to take a look, make sure, if you haven't had a chance to look at it before the meeting, take a look after. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the last quarter. Staff has worked on, from obviously education, outreach, conservation science, stewardship, and restoration all on the ground. So please take a look at that. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next, we move on to the technical committee with Neil. Looking very green today.
Left my festive tie at home. When the kids got me, had the Grinch on it. That didn't seem appropriate. They thought it was appropriate. The technical committee's met once since your last meeting, the last commission meeting. The project review remains relatively light. There were 3 new projects, all of them relatively minor and are pretty heavily developed areas. And of course, the landfill habitat restoration project continues. And I'll start there. The city and their consultants have been continuing with what they're calling the 3rd phase of the habitat restoration work, which is part of the mitigation package for the most recent expansion of the landfill. And some minor changes in that they took on a pretty significant role in-house of doing some of the land clearing and some of the actual physical restoration work, and that's been going along very smoothly. I've been impressed with the city's staff, and the quality of the work that they're doing on the ground and the communication between Joe Giebelhaus at the landfill office and his staff with myself, Carl Parker from the department, has been outstanding. So the project continues more or less on track and on course. But if anybody wants to read about 2012 and the habitat restoration project, here's the annual compliance report that they provided me, and I'm only a couple hundred pages into the 700 so far. But I also wanted to point out a couple of other things. And this is in the update, but there were 3 new professional manuscripts that were published of commission science over the last 3 or 4 months, really. And all 3 of them were kind of led by Jason Breed, who was our former preserve ecologist, and we allowed him to continue to work on these projects and get these things published. So one was in restoration ecology, one was in the Journal of Insect Conservation, and the last one that I really wanted to point out was only just published recently in the Northeastern Naturalist. And this one is about frosted elfins, and I wanted to point out Amanda Dillon. Dillon is our field ecologist and environmental educator, and Dillon played a large role not only in collecting all of this data, but also in getting this paper published. And this one is highly relevant. The elfin also feeds on lupin. It's a state threatened species, and the state has convened a recovery team to build a recovery plan, much like we did for the Carner. And Dylan and I sit on that plan with department staff and some other folks. But the work that we're doing in the preserve is directly being fed right up the chain into the state's recovery planning for this animal. We're one of the few places in upstate New York that has abundant frosted elfin populations. And the paper is all about how do we survey them and what can we tell from the information that we're collecting in the field. Any questions on any of the technical committee projects, or
If people want copies of those papers, we can send them the PDF.
Yes, we have PDFs of all 3 of those, so if anybody wants them,
Yes.
be glad.
You would?
Be glad to distribute them.
Yeah.
Yep. Can do.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Jeff? Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Now, next we'll move on to Jeff Fulmer with the Discovery Center report.
You don't have to be as tall as Neil to hit the snowflake. So I come bearing show and tell items. The first thing that we're very proud of is the Discovery Center was honored to receive the Outstanding Building of the Year Award from the from BOMA, which is the Buildings and Office Managers Association. It's a national association, so this was the local chapter, and there were several awards. We received ours in our class, and that was pretty exciting. In addition to the gateway entrance, we've also been doing some other improvements. We're working on the native landscaping project that I believe I reported on in the past, so we've made some progress on that. This is a demonstration project that will show native landscaping all along the north wall and will help improve our appearance as well, make us more inviting. We've also been working on energy savings, and I talked about some of that in the past, but we continue to do that in a number of ways, looking at our heating, cooling, lighting, energy conservation and weatherization, so that'll be an ongoing thing for some time. In terms of outreach and communications, Wendy's been doing a great job. And the education staff too, collaborating on the Smoky Bear Day, which was a great success, and we got terrific coverage on that in TV, print, online, and also TV, print, and online for the prescribed burn that we did out here at the Discovery Center, and that was really great press. We were on the front page of the Gazette. Neil was featured in the Times Union in a terrific article. He hadn't seen that on his achieving his master bird banding license, is it? Permit. And the work that we're doing here with bird banding. So that was in the Times Union. We have a new turtle. So if you want to see our new addition to our animal collection, we have a painted turtle, not on display to the public yet because he's very young and learning the ropes. But we're excited to have the painted turtle here. And if you want to visit him, he's in the Lupin Learning Center.
Does he have a name?
We don't name our animals here.
They're wild animals.
Good
they don't
science,
get
good
names.
science, good concept. His name is Painted Turtle, as opposed to Box Turtle and Musk Turtle and so forth. We had about 1,400 attendees between September and November in our education programs, about half split between school groups and the public, so that was great. If you're driving down it would be up Monday, 787. If you're driving north on 787, we have a terrific new billboard, which is really exciting because we have to take advantage of every opportunity to promote the Discovery Center and the Albany Pine Bush Preserve and what we're doing. A lot of thought went into what went in this. So the top is what you would be seeing. It's one of these digital billboards, so it runs over 5,000 times. 500 times a day. What's the impressions? 550,000 is the estimated number of impressions that people do. And it's also online, so that's pretty exciting too. And I don't have as big a book as Neil did, but we're also very excited to have published, for the first time we've published a book. And if you hadn't heard about this before, this was put together some time ago by kids at the Farnsworth Middle School as part of the program that Dr. Alan Fierro has. And we've been looking into getting this out to the public for a while, and we decided to go full force and actually publish it. So it's the real deal. It's got, it's registered to the Library of Congress. It's got a UPC code and an ISBN number and all that. And it is available for purchase in our Discovery shop. And I'm just going to pass it around because there's already seen that. So we're excited to have that. And we'll be doing some great promotion on that in January. It came out a little. The timing wasn't right for the holidays, but it is here. So if you want to pick up a couple for any kids you know, and it's a really the story behind it is really interesting. So if you get a chance to read that on the back cover or on the back inside cover, do so. And that is my report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Next, we'll hear from Lisa on the financial report.
Good morning. Does everybody have the cream tan financial reports? Okay. We will begin our report with a statement of financial activities, and this represents our year-to-date figures through the month of October.
2012. We'll begin with revenue. Dues and contributions are higher than budget, and this is due to an increase in donations throughout the year. Government grant income is 70% of our budget, and this is based on an estimate throughout the year. This is directly related to our expenses, which are also down for the year. Mitigation revenue is under budget, and this is based on the decrease in tonnage from the landfill, as Jean mentioned, but we're hoping an increase for the next quarter. Investment income, we budget at 0, and we will realize this at the end of the year if needed. Lease revenue is slightly higher than budget. This is due to an increase in revenue for our Barron's House, which is our seasonal staff lease revenue. And other revenue is higher than budget. This is due to increase, as Jeff had mentioned, in program fees. Both school and public and merchandise sales are up for a year, bringing our revenue at 77% of our budget through the month of October, primarily reflected in our grant revenue, decrease in grant revenue at this point. Moving on to expenses. Personnel and fringe are under budget at 79% of budget due to a timing of large benefit payments, and this will catch up over the year and get closer to our budgeted figure as time goes on through March 31st. Travel and training are under budget due to timing of expenses and the budgeted month, and also weather conditions for our controlled burn. Some of the travel is based on that and training. Contractual is under budget at 38%, and this is due to our large outstanding contracts. They did not incur, we did not incur by October 31st, but we've made several large payments, about $215,000 through December of this year. Communications, these are all under budget. Communications under budget due to both timing of budgeted items, and we had a cost savings in both postage and telecommunications for the year so far, so we're hoping to see that throughout the end of the year moving forward. Occupancy is at 48% of the budget, and this is due to the timing of budget repairs that have not yet occurred, and a significant savings from our management company on our electric bill, which is Carol. Supplies and equipment. This is hopefully will be closer to end of the budget. This is just a timing based on purchases. We had conservative spending the first 6 months of the year, and since then we've initiated a lot of projects, so that should come close to budget by the end of the year. Other expenses are $220,000 under. This is due to the purchase of our land, and we have incurred that expense and paid it as of December. Total expenses are 56% of our budget, and revenue is 77% of our budget, giving us a significantly higher net income than our budget of $281,000 for the year. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay.
This is fiscal year April 1st.
Through March 31st, yeah. And we'll have a better idea probably next month what our expenses will come in at. Moving on to the statement of net assets. Our operating cash is higher than budget, and this is due to timing of payments that we've received timely payments from DEC and our expenditures, the time we cut checks for our expenditures. Conservation and land reserves, our conservation land reserves remain unchanged through October. Grants receivable, these are grant funds due for both federal and state, and this is just a timing issue of payments versus expenses. Accounts receivable is money owed for our quarterly mitigation, and this was actually paid in the month of November. Inventory was a slight increase due to purchases for our gift shop, and this will vary depending on what we purchase throughout the year. Prepaid expenses for the year are 0, and investments had a positive performance through October, increasing approximately $72,000. Capital assets increased due to recent purchases of capital expenditures, giving us total assets, an increase in total assets of $296,000 due to increase in cash, accounts receivable, capital assets, and an increase in investment income. Moving on to liabilities, accounts payable and accrued expenses decreased, and this is due to the reduction of accounts payable for the month of October. Deferred revenue is at 0, and total liabilities decreased due to the reduction of both accounts payable and deferred revenue. Moving on to net assets. Investments in capital assets increased due to purchases this year of capital expenditures. Reserved assets, this was a slight adjustment. This was just due to reconciling our TNC cash accounts. And unreserved increased due to a positive net operating income and an increase in our investment income. Is there any questions on the balance sheet? Okay, final report in our packet is our investment summary for the month of October 31st, 2012. Our reserve fund is doing well, once again with a 5.53% gain. And both our Discovery Center endowment and endowment have had a positive performance, coming in at 1.71% and 1.63%. Overall, our investments had a positive performance with a gain of $72,000 through the month of October. So, does anybody have any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Before I turn it over to Chris for the next item on the agenda, I just want to offer my own 2 cents here. We're gonna miss you, Bill. You've given so much over so many years to the commission that you'll be leaving behind a void that you'll have to let Mike know it's very large shoes he's trying to step into. I've only been with the commission now for a little over 5 years, and I mean, you've been a constant presence on everything we've done of significance. You've never hesitated to offer your time, your expertise, your opinion where it's been needed, and people like you are truly remarkable. It's hard to say goodbye to you, so but we do it knowing that you're moving on to things that you really want to do, and we're happy for you in that regard. But I will miss you. I'll miss seeing you on a regular basis, and I hope that you do come back from time to time to join us. I'll turn it over to Chris.
Well, I won't go on too long either, because I don't care much for these things. Bill doesn't publicly speak very much or take recognition when even. I met Bill when I started here in March of 1993. I met Bill, who was then working on. He was part of the technical committee representing the city, and the technical committee was finalizing and wrapping up, as Paul Russell would know. Russell's now retired from the town of Colony. We're wrapping up the first management plan, the 1993 management plan, which was adopted in May. So I had to look back into the minutes of the commission. Everybody knows the commission was started, or the legislation was adopted in the fall. You know, it was 1988. It was the fall of 1988. So the commission's first meeting was April of 1989. The second meeting of the commission was July of 1989, and that was Bill's first meeting that he attended. He may have been at the first one. So Bill has been here from the beginning, and the first thing that the commission tried to figure out was, how do we get this management plan started? How do we pay for it? How do we start this research and management program within the preserve? And how do we pay for somebody to do that? And Bill was really integral in getting that done and working with the city, because the city was in the process of expanding its landfill and looking at opportunities to help the commission, knowing that there was going to be impacts on the preserve and how to mitigate them. So the first funding that came to the commission was from the landfill. So like I said, Bill's first meeting for the commission was July of 1989. That was 23 years ago. So Bill, like myself, we were accelerated children starting our careers at age 10. And one other thing I was just going to add is Bill and I share heritage as well as Neil Gifford. We all went to Plattsburgh State, SUNY Plattsburgh, and we went through the environmental science program. So we all have background in that. So I just wanted to say thanks, Bill, for all that you've done.
If I can just take you back a little further, Chris. I was at the meeting.
When I was 9.
I was at the meeting in it's either late '87 or early '88 at the DEC Commissioner's office. It was, believe it or not, the Commissioner's name was Hank Williams.
Mark's father.
When it was agreed that we would, we needed to ramp up and take it to the next level, because there was no commission, there was no management entity. The TNC had a couple hundred acres, the city had a couple hundred acres, DEC, Parks and Rec, but there was some informal coordination and cooperation, but that was it. And there was some real serious, development threats that could have irreversibly, fragmented the lobes. And so I volunteered to Paul Gray, who people know now as a TV commentator, but he was an attorney in legislative bill drafting back then, who did a lot of work for DEC and Parks and Rec. And it was Paul who drafted the legislation, and a couple of us worked with him on it. I don't know, Paul, were you at that meeting? Paul was there. Fred Field from Colony, Kevin Moss from Gilderland, and Tom Whalen from Albany, and we got the legislation tweaked it, revised it. And in '88, we made the rounds at the legislative office building to get support and got it approved. And I think the first Governor Cuomo signed it like the very last week of 1988. We were afraid it wasn't going to get signed and we had to start with it. So it's always been a good group of people here. We've always had a lot of fun working together. When I wasn't busy working with the commission, I was busy horrifying them with yet another landfill expansion proposal. And that was the most funny of all.
Thanks, Bill. We, Wendy, who's our Director of Communication and Outreach, has always worked her creative ways in putting things together. So Wendy put together a nice hardcover book with photos over the years of the pine bush. It's not here yet, despite ordering it on December 7th. So in lieu of that, which is coming, I would like to present you, Mr. Bruce, with the very first copy of the very first published book of the Pine Bush Commission.
Do I get a box of crayons?
You get crayons?
Thanks, Chief.
So Chris is scheming to bring Bill back to another meeting, I can see.
Yes.
Very good, very good. Well, obviously, Bill, the door is always open, and you don't have to be invited. You're welcome anytime.
Well, I was telling Mike before the meeting that I'm going on the Shaker Heritage Society board in January, so you'll see me paint the barns over by the Emily Pond come springtime.
Nice, that's good. Well, they're lucky to get you. Thank you very much. Next, we've got 2 action items that Chris will go through.
Sure. The first is the annual plan. Now remember, the annual plan and the budget for fiscal year 13-14, which starts in April 2013, we would typically do this, or we have historically done this in March, at the March board meeting. We have to do it now because of the requirements of the Public Authorities Law. As a state authority, we have to have a budget with a resolution passed and adopted by the board so we can upload it into the Public Authorities Reporting Information System by the 31st of December. So that's why we're doing it early this year. So in your board packet, you have the annual plan, which is blue. The annual plan, if you look at it, you'll see that it's very similar to last year. There's not a whole lot of change. We don't change these a lot year to year. We got away from a lot of the quantitative measures that we put in this, and we do that specifically in-house when we have meetings and with employee objectives. This is more or less a summary that we put together. It's an outline based on program area from protection, management, education, outreach, and staffing and administration based on the management plan. So it ties directly back to that. We have to adopt this every year because it ties also into our contract for our EPF appropriation. So that's it. I don't have much else to add. If you have any specific questions, I can answer those or try to.
Chris, I had a question under the natural resource management, under fire management.
Yeah.
It notes that prepare 200 acres to be available for fire management.
Yep.
During next year, 2013. Probably could just go back and look at last year's, but
what was the acreage last year?
Well, what was our goal for last year? And actually, what did we want to accomplish? Are we near that 200? Or
No, not with this season. You know how many acres we burned this year? 28? 28.
Because it was so dry.
How many? 17. 28, 17. Leave it to the executive director to boost it. 17. So this year, we didn't burn at all in spring or summer. It was, again, another challenging year. But we burned twice this fall. And I didn't even mention Tyler Briggs. Tyler Briggs is our new fire management and GIS specialist. Tyler's worked for us as a seasonal employee in fire, comes to us with a lot of fresh fire background and GIS experience. And he was the coordinator of our first 2 fall burns that we've done here this year in the fall in 20 years. We haven't burned in the fall since 1992, which is pretty impressive. So going back to your question, Mike, we prepared, I don't know how many acres. It was over 200 this year. It's like 220.
Yeah.
How many? 2?
Yeah, it was over 200.
So last year said the same thing in this annual plan. I'm sure of it. Because we always have a minimum of 200 to prepare. And we prepare units based on where they are in need of being burned. You know, if they've been mowed or whatever, or you know, if we're trying to promote habitat next to caribou habitat. And we prepare those, like you and I had a conversation about this a little bit, but we need to prepare a certain number of acres, so on any given day, depending on what the wind direction is, we can pick and choose. So the fire breaks are prepared, any mowing is done, all the plans are in place, all the permits are in place, so everything's ready to go.
And one other question is, once an area is prepared for burn,
Yeah.
you don't burn on that.
Yep.
How many years is that still
Viable?
viable or available to be burned without significant? I understand grasses would have to be cut, but
Sure.
without getting into significant using the hydro axe or something like that.
It would depend what kind of habitat it is. If you know, if it's scrub oak that's been mowed, it could probably go 5 years or less, probably up to 5 years. But the actual preparation for fire breaks, that has to be done year after year, no matter what, because the fire breaks are going to grow up. They have to be raked. They have to be cleaned. Some burn prescriptions, if they're over 5 years old, we update them, and they'll have to go back through the approval process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Brad. That's right. Come on, sit down. Anywhere. Brad Fisher, Albany County,
Yes,
Director of
sir.
Operations. Welcome.
Late to the party.
That's okay.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Any other questions on the annual plan? No.
Okay, if there's no additional questions, I'll entertain a motion to move to a vote.
Motion.
Second. Thank you, Steve. All in favor of adopting action item A, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission 2013-14 annual plan, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, action item A is carried unanimously.
Thank you. The next resolution is the bright pink one in your packet, action item B. That's the operating budget for fiscal year 13-14. That and the budget's at the end. And I will walk you through that, the important changes of that compared to this year. So that's behind the pink. And this was reviewed by the audit committee last week. John Bruss is the chair of that. John Bruss is our treasurer. So John, if you have any comments on it, once I go through it, or in between. So if you look at the 2 columns, on the left is the proposed budget for 13-14. On the right is the current fiscal year 12-13. So that's based on, if you look at revenue, federal grants, the 36,000 plus, that's the balance of our National Fire Plan grant. And that does not include funding that we were pretty assured that we'll get from Fish and Wildlife Field. We think we're getting that this year?
Yes.
10,000, but we didn't include it because it's not guaranteed. So, state and local grants, that's the $2 million. That's a $2 million appropriation from the state through the EPF. That's just assuming that it's proposed by the governor in the executive budget, and then finalized in the actual budget by the legislature for April 1st. Mitigation fees, you'll see that drop So currently, we had budgeted $450,000 this year for mitigation fees, and that's specifically from the landfill tipping fees. Because we're seeing a decrease, we decided to budget conservatively and knocked it down to $360 this year. Gene's report, he mentioned that more waste is coming in from Sandy, Hurricane Sandy. That may go up. It may impact next year. I think it's wise to budget conservatively, and if it goes up, we change the budget from there.
Yeah, let me just say, it'll be a short-term bump, if there's any bump from Sandy, because the waste that had been staged in New York City is essentially moved now, and it's being or is about to be disposed entirely. What remains is just a small amount of waste on Long Island, because most of the Long Island waste has been moved as well. So as I mentioned, the emergency authorization expires on January 14th, and we don't anticipate there being a need beyond January 14th for increased capacity to deal with sandy waste.
Thanks, Gene. Let's see, investment income, because that's another change. So you see we had that in the budget last year, that's 65.8. We don't typically take that money. That's there if we need it. So I didn't include it this year. Lisa and I did not include it when we put this budget together. If we need it, we can put it in, but again, I'd rather keep it out and ask the board for it if we were in need. I'll skip down. Lease revenue, that is primarily the lease revenue from the Nature Conservancy as tenants upstairs, but also includes lease revenue from the Barron's house, from seasonal employees that live there. And we expect contributions to go up close to $10,000 this year. Under expenses, actually before I go to that, revenue, any questions on revenue? Okay. Expenses, salaries and benefits, that's up slightly from this year. That includes, in the past we have budgeted for both a 4% merit increase for staff and a 4% step increase. And that's based on the decision that the governor makes for management confidential employees, because that's what we follow based on our bylaws. That has not happened this year, either one. We're being, again, conservative. We're just going to budget one for next year, just the 4%. There's enough funding in this year to carry over, but I think it's better to be conservative. Contractual, down a little bit. Telecommunications is down. Postage and freight continues to go down. We've watched this go down. I mentioned this in the audit committee. We watch this go down every year because we mail, and probably everybody does the same thing, we mail much less than we ever used to, even though postage rates have gone up, because documents go electronically now. Printing and photos up a little bit. One of the main categories that has gone up more is under public relation, advertising, and events. You'll see last year it was at 21.3, this year it's 43.1. And that's specifically to continue to increase the amount of foot traffic and people that know who we are, what we do, and focusing specifically on the Discovery Center. And that's one of the reasons that we hired Jeff with his background, Jeff Fulmer. And you can already see when Lisa was going through the revenue report, you can see that our revenue from program fees alone, which is, program fees are only $3 a person, $5 a family. They're up, they're almost double. They're at 187%. So you're seeing a change in that already. And we want to continue that. And that also includes two events. One is the Lupin Fest, which we were going to bring more, I would say, interesting people to, musicians, and we would have to pay them. And we're looking at doing the 25-year event for the commission, because this year, 2013, is the 25-year anniversary. Pig roast. We haven't done pig roast in a while. Let me see, we haven't.
Sorry, Chris.
No, you're right. Let's see, travel, which we're actually going to change that category of travel and transportation. You'll see that's going up quite a bit because now we're keeping all of our fuel in there. We used to include that under equipment lease and maintenance from an accounting standpoint. We are now putting it in that category. Trainings and meetings is up a little bit, specifically for, we are now doing first aid for all of our volunteers, all of our staff. We do that in-house, and also for staff development. Moving down, you see significant decreases in all those lines for various reasons, and I can answer those if you have questions. Occupancy is down a little bit. That's primarily focusing on a continued expectation that our utility costs will continue to decrease. We're seeing, Lisa mentioned this, Caro, our real estate management company, has gotten us a reduction in our electrical rates, and we're continuing to see that decrease. Marketing and promotion, about the same. Inventory for the Discovery Shop is level. Dues, fees, and licenses, insurance, all that's all about the same. And you'll see at the bottom there, land purchase. That's the property that we acquired. And that was mentioned, we did close on that property. That property is now, the deed is now in the hands of DEC, and DEC is in the process of putting together a package to dedicate that to the preserve. So total expenses, if you look at the operating budget surplus this year, there's a surplus of $43,765 versus $2,800 last year. Going down, we have capital expenditures, equipment over $5,000, which brings it down a little bit. One is a phone system. The Nature Conservancy, which we share a phone system with, is replacing their phone system because it's becoming obsolete. We're considering doing our own, and it's considerably less than the last time we did it. This is about $13,000. And the other piece of equipment is a new GPS unit, which is about $6,400. So with a bottom line of the cash flow budget surplus in operations of $24,340. I know it's kind of long-winded, but I thought it'd be valuable. Yes.
On salaries and benefits.
Yes.
It doesn't look like there's really anything in there for increases.
There is. There's 4%.
But 4% of 1.4 million has got to be more than just
There's less
less staff.
seasonals
Okay.
because some of the seasonals are being supported otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a conservative number because, since you asked,
Yeah.
this year, if you look at that 1425, that salary that we're at now,
Yeah.
this year currently includes an 8% increase across the board for full-time permanent staff. 4% for merit, 4% for steps. And we budget that. You know, in the administrative world of how this should function is that should occur on April 1st, but that's up to the governor. So that's budgeted April 1. Here we are.
Yeah.
This is going through October. We haven't had that at all. So that's considerably over-projected. I don't think it's going to happen by March, but I don't know. So we have to keep it there. And it could go retroactive, but you don't know. Probably not. So that's why we just put the 4 in for next year.
I think the only way that it will is if there's a pay raise for the legislature, which is dubious, and
Hopefully not.
whether there's a pay raise for commissioner level appointees, which is probably tied to the legislative pay raise.
Right.
So,
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank
Okay.
you.
Other people have questions on the budget?
I was, actually, I'm just glad to see that the training line item on the budget there has gone up, because I believe over the last 1 or 2 budgets, it's actually dropped down
It has.
considerable.
It
So I'm
has.
glad to see it go back up, so that, you know, staff has that ability to receive the training that is always needed.
And on top of that, I don't know if we mentioned this at a board meeting before, but I worked with Gene and the central office at DEC. We are now directly tied into their training unit, and we are offered all their training courses at no charge. So they're I think there's probably 5 or 6 a month, or every 2 months that are offered. Does Parks have that too? They do.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So it's something that's another benefit that
Yeah,
we're getting
you're
from
welcome
training.
to join our, I can put you on our list too, for the
That'd
ones
be
that
great.
we offer, and then you can participate in ours too.
I'll
Okay.
bet theirs are more fun than ours.
No, geez, we get, I
We
think there's
have to
staff in here.
sometimes.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, the fact, Margie Steiner, office manager, who's not here today, thank you, Wendy, for helping out with everything, putting it all together. Margie is actually out of training today. Are there any other questions on the budget? No? Okay.
Okay. If there's nothing further, I'll entertain a motion to move it to a vote. Second.
I'll second.
All in favor of adopting action item B, the 2013-14 budget, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Okay, item B is carried unanimously. Next, we move on to a pair of presentation and discussion topics. First being the long-awaited hydrogeologic study by H2H Associates. And Mark Williams is here to present that. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Chair Kelly. Let there be light. We're gonna
Take a second to warm back up.
Did I?
They've been asleep, so now they gotta wake back up and come up in the morning without coffee.
Yeah, don't let
There we
Bruce
go.
touch anything, really. Well, the first thing there it goes.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't break it. Just temporarily, paralyzed it.
Yeah.
Chair Kelly, commission members, representatives, executive director, Oliver, preserve staff. I think it's quite an honor for us to make this presentation today, give an overview of the hydrogeologic setting for the Albany pine bush. In my opinion, this provides the preserve a great opportunity to maintain a key component of their mission, which is stewardship. Stewardship for not only the things that some people appreciate, but stewardship for the entire area associated with the pine bush. The other opportunity that I think is very significant and untapped for the Discovery Center is this could serve as a major platform for education. And I think that as time goes on, I think that those two elements would be very critical associated with this hydrogeologic evaluation. The first thing I'd like to demonstrate is that the term, as I mentioned, I think the first time we met, is that people think different things when you mention the word pine bush. If it's a political boundary, some people may define it differently than how biologists, geologists, and other educators may interpret it. But for the purposes of our study, the corridor is pretty much defined as the Commission defines it, with the added components that relate to the hydrogeology, which is essentially north of Route 20, east of Route 146 in the town of Gilliland, and south of Route 5 in the town of Colony, and essentially the western edge of the city of Albany. Okay? The hydrology of the Pine Bush area, this was a map that we provided to the technical committee. This was what was known before we started to collect all the data. And I'd like to preface that with thanks to the various municipalities that helped provide us information that they knew, specifically various municipal water supply investigations, environmental investigations where they had to define the hydrogeology of a particular area. They were very helpful, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Albany County Department of Health. Chris had a chat with some of their people, and they were very responsive and helped build our database with the specificity that we needed to be able to move forward with refining and defining specific elements of the conceptual model. It was critical. I'd also like to thank the Division of Water staff, the hydrogeologists and geologists within the DEC Central. Also, we contacted some folks in Region 4. They were also very helpful and informative. They also have e-online tools that were also useful to gather our knowledge base. Then the last group that we'd like to acknowledge is the New York State Geologic Survey. They have a lot of information. The problem is, similar to DEC Region 4 headquarters, their filing system is a little bit desired because they've been moved so many times. So we've had quite a bit of challenge, but the assistant geologist has a great akin to the Albany Pine Bush area. He did a lot of his postdoc work in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and the area that he studied was nearly identical to the Albany Pine Bush. And he has some ideas for some future funding that he is going to get to do additional geologic evaluation of the Albany Pine Bush. So I would like at some point to introduce him to the Preserve Commission and their staff to ensure that we all share information and gather our knowledge base as we go. One of the initial things he did when he came to New York State was he did some radioactive dating of some of the sediments associated with the Albany Pine Bush, and he found dramatically that the deposit is much younger than previously thought of. And I'll send some notes to Chris and Neil to provide some additional data about that. But again, this it demonstrates the opportunity of education. It can educate kids understanding what groundwater means, what is an aquifer, the elemental base components to very detailed academic endeavors. And I think that that's part of the stewardship platform that I was referring to. So essentially, when you look at the hydrology, you have, it's not quite exactly this, but there's a surface water divide that separates the Albany Pine Bush. And it is somewhat close to the New York State Thruway corridor, okay? Essentially to the north of, let me make sure I got this right here. There we go. North this way, you have tributaries such as Shakers Creek and the Elisha that flow towards Mohawk, okay? Then to the south, you have the west and east branches of the Hunger Kill, you have the Cakeout Kill, and you have the Blackhouse Creek. Those all flow south to the Norris Kill, which ultimately discharge into the Hudson River. This is unique. It's just about everything associated with this evaluation is dynamic, in that there's no simple answer for pretty much everything. I mean, not too many times do you do a study of this size and have to deal with two different surface water divides. You have the surface water divide that ultimately becomes a groundwater divide, as I'll explain in a bit. You also have some unique superficial hydrologic features, the vernal pools, which are a function of the geology. There are kettles and various superficial deposits that have silts and clays. And so you have essentially puddling or ponding that occurs in these areas, and they have a unique relationship between the superficial sand aquifer and the vernal pools. A lot of them right now, as we'll show later, they're, I wouldn't say drying up, but they're significantly smaller than maybe they were 4 or 5 years ago. In general, it's been pretty dry year, as most people know. Okay. One of the key elements here, and this gets back to how I would define the pine bush versus maybe how the commission's order defines it. But in my mind, the pine bush and its geology is dictated by the Aeolian sands and the sands directly below, which are primarily a fine sand. It is sometimes a silty fine sand, but essentially the areas in yellow represent the dune type sands, Aeolian deposits, wind-blown sands, and the light green represents the other element that in my mind constitutes the pine bush, and that is the lacustrine sands. This deposit is not just in Albany County and parts of Schenectady County. It also goes all the way up to Glens Falls. Many people drive up and they're going to West Mountain, what have you. If you look at the median between the north and southbound side, you'll see that those dune deposits are right there for everybody to view. And many of the vegetation that you see here is also there. There are scrub pines up that way. So that's a key element here, and when we build the conceptual model for the pine bush, this is a major source of the data that we built that model with. Essentially, you have here is a cross-section that we took from Deneen. And when we talk about what our references were, our objective was to build a database of wells. And we used various known published resources dating back, Phil, I think you mentioned this last time we met. You look at Arnaud, 1929 was the first real groundwater resources study of Albany County. But we also used more recent publications, primarily by Robert Deneen, who at the time was our surficial geologist for the state of New York. And also we had information by Eric Hansen that was currently an RPI student at the time. We also, at the same time, the USGS and Deborah Snavely was doing a separate report. And they were doing them blindly. They printed them almost on the same month. And both of them were critical resources to our report because it was helpful to calibrate the information we received from the County Department of Health. It helped us fill in gaps in areas where there's less well data than others. For example, one thing I can tell Chris and the staff is you don't have any data gaps or needs to put any wells in the superficial sand aquifer in northwestern Gilbert. There are more sand points than you can put shake a stick at. And it's primarily because people use these points. It's available groundwater. They can use it to irrigate their lawns. They can use it to fill their pools. And the water quality is good enough and the quantity is good enough that they can do it pretty cheaply. Okay? Essentially, if you look at the profile, and sorry for the graininess of the presentation, but that's why I gave some hard copies for everybody to look at. But essentially, you have at surface you have the dune sands, some channelized deposits, and some custrine sands. Transitionally, you go into about a 20-foot thick sequence of silty fine sands, and then you go into a confining to semi-confining silt and clay unit, also of the custrine origin. And that unit is variable in thickness, but all research shows that it's mostly continuous throughout the pine bush and serves as a confining unit hydrogeologically. I'll explain that later. And then underneath, you have a critical deposit that filled in during early glacial times of a high-energy ice contact sand and gravel deposit. This is referred to as a buried deposit because it has a confining unit above it. It's under extreme pressure, and it is known for producing very high yields to various users, including municipalities, commercial entities, golf courses, what have you. And then under that is a thin veneer of till. Sometimes there's a bit of clayey-rich soils that are beneath the till. The till is of a lodgement variety. It's very hard. It has a clayey matrix, and it is also a confining unit. And then underneath that are the bedrocks of the Schenectady and Normanville Shale Formation. Okay. Getting back to our charge d'affaires, our primary focus here was to get a better understanding of how the aquifers perform in the pine bush and what the sensitivities are that the Preserve Commission should be aware of. And this, some people may recall that when John Williams from the USGS came by, he gave a brief overview of certain elements. And this is a good snapshot. I talked to John and he allowed me to use this because it sort of captures all elements as it applies to the pine bush. You have essentially recharge, infiltration, precipitation. That's what the arrows at the top represent. They hit the ground surface. All the ground surface, with the exception of a few small areas, consists of the windblown sand or the glacial lake sands. And as it percolates down, which they're considered well drained to excessively drained on average. And then you can see that the superficial tributaries that exist, the Hunger Kill, the Cakeout Kill, the Elisha Kill, those areas are essentially where the upper water table is exposed. And you can see here the discharge relationship that you have groundwater flow here, and then it discharges along the tributaries. So you can get a good idea of what the groundwater habit is by just watching and evaluate where the water levels are in these various tributaries. It's a very important tool to evaluate in time, and I think that's one of the things that Chris, Neil, and I have talked about is to path forward. I think the one thing is to keep an eye on the asset as a steward to make sure that everything that is needed for protection, that you have your eye on certain key points. Essentially, the glacial lake clay you see right here, this is the confining unit, and underneath, right in this area would be your buried sand and gravel deposit. The buried sand and gravel deposit is not very thick. In general, it's probably less than 20 feet thick, but it's under extreme pressure and in many cases wasn't tapped for thousands of years. There are a lot of wells in areas along the Route 20 corridor as you go from 155 west, near like Western Turnpike, Gate Farm, those areas, because there's a pre-glacial channel that connected pre-glacial Mohawk River to the Hudson River, and that was the channel. It was not the channel you know now. And then that's where, when the glaciers first came and meltwaters first were deposited, those high energy deposits filled in those channels.
Mark?
Yes.
Is that surface water over by Dutch Manor a remnant of that, or is it related to it?
Yeah, it's a little complicated because it's referred to as Glass Pond, and I always knew it as Dutch Hill and Dutch Hill Estates. The pond used to be much smaller when I was a kid growing up in Gilbert. And you'll look at Deborah Snavely's picture later down the road, and you can see it's just that little area to the west of where access road is. But the answer is yes, and the answer is that the current alignment of the western side of that pond is really mimicking what they call the Ballston Channel, which is another pre-glacial channel that was created. And many of the tributaries that you see on the south side of the divide are directly correlated with what you see relative to buried channel deposits, whether it be Colony on the eastern side of the Pine Bush or the Mohawk or Ballston in the central or western side of the Pine Bush. We'll see a picture later on to make sense of that. Does that answer your question?
It does, thanks.
This is another, I wanted to revisit some things that John Williams presented and sort of provided a snapshot or an update. If you recall, when he made the presentation, I believe in kind of late 2011, September 2011, around there, that was at a time obviously where there were some record highs, not just in New York State, not just in the Pine Bush, but the entire Northeast. And that is represented by this area up here. The one fact I'd like to make sense of this is, I think he also compared it to some other areas of the state. I don't think that that's the proper thing to do, but I do want to make note of this. This is on the eastern side of Pine Bush, and the depth of water on the eastern side of Pine Bush is much less than it is, say, where the Curry Road exit is on 890, where depth of water can be greater than 50 feet. And as you go north to south, it's the same kind of concept. You have depth of water increases in the areas from north to south. So, although it's a little more consistent on the north to south as it is east to west. Okay. But you can see here, obviously we're in this period now. I'm currently working on a project up in Fort Drum, which is also the only other geologic setting that is comparable to this. That had the same type of deltaic sequence, fine sands, and they are experiencing record lows, and they've been monitoring water levels for about 25 years, and they're a half foot below the record low that they've ever received during that period. And I think that if you went back and tracked back to 1973 when this hydrograph first started, I think you would see that we're getting to one of those lower periods. This is a snapshot of a component of our water well inventory. You can see that there are some wells that we didn't put that were used to make Deneen's cross-section. But essentially this is the fruit of getting the information from the DEC, getting information from the key published reports, and also our friends at the Albany County Department of Health. And what I wanted to do was define that our water well inventory, the purpose is to understand the habit, the character, and the sensitivity of the wells that are tapping three major aquifer systems. You have a superficial sand aquifer, which is what we sort of talked about in that block model. And that is, some people call it the Pine Bush Aquifer. The problem is that other people call the Pine Bush Aquifer the buried aquifer. So I'd like to refer to it as the upper superficial unconfined sand aquifer, okay? Because that's what it is. And essentially that ranges in thickness between 25 to 65 feet thick. Typically, throughout the section, it's about 25 feet to water, and yields are typically between 10 to 15 gallons per minute if taxed. But the majority of the people don't tax it that much because they're just using it for short-term intermittent use to water their lawn or fill a pool or what have you. It's not a common municipal water supply, partly because it's so shallow, and because it's so shallow, it's sensitive to other factors, so its quality isn't the greatest. Okay. Essentially, you also have, and I'll show another map at the back end of the presentation, because really I think that the focus here is to talk about the superficial sand aquifer, because that's the most critical for current issues before the reserve. And so the other aquifer that is tapped is below the silt and clay, the lacustrine silt and clay, and that is the buried deposit. That is sands and gravels, and it is found in certain pre-glacial channels. It is bound above by the silt and clay deposits and bound below by either till and or shale bedrock. It has great yields on the order of greater than 200 gallons per minute, and it is well known by certain municipalities as a resource that they can use. The only problem is it's not a resource they can use for reliable quality, because the quality is high in iron, high in manganese, and any of the people representing various municipalities know that if you got high iron, high manganese, your municipal water operators aren't going to be too happy. So, but they serve great needs for those areas for irrigation, such as the golf course. The last aquifer that we collected data on was the bedrock aquifer. And essentially we created a database that has over 145 wells in the superficial sand aquifer. We have about 30 to 35 wells that we collected data on in the buried sand and gravel aquifer. And then we have about key bedrock wells, we have probably about 20-25. It gives us a good snapshot. It tells us generally what the trends are. And we use this information to calibrate with other published references to see what made sense, what didn't, what sorted out. Okay. And this is where we ultimately came up with it. I think that if you look at your hard copy maps, this is probably your second to last map. And I had mentioned that the thruway corridor was sort of an informal divide, but in reality, the divide is actually to the north, and the groundwater divide and surface water divide somewhat mimic each other. The superficial sand aquifer essentially discharges to the surface water tributaries, so it percolates down and then discharges to the closest tributary along known hydraulic gradients. And what we did is we looked at published references, Deneen, Hansen and their work in 1983 through 87. We also looked at Snavely's report, comprehensive report of the Albany Pine Bush. We looked at Arnaud's historical information, although somewhat dated, was still somewhat fruitful. And then we applied the information we collected from the database, and we applied some basic hydrologic tools to map where we think a conceptual water table contour is. And sure enough, when we did it, they all came up with the same habit, pretty much across the entire area. And partly because essentially the groundwater habit mimics topography. and essentially the discharge features are known in all areas. So it's pretty easy to figure out, and we were very happy that we used 5 or 6 references and they came up and they all look very similar. We thought for the purposes of this presentation and the benefit to the commission, we used Deborah Snavely's report. It lined up perfectly with today's maps, which is amazing to look at a 1983 report and see the level of detail and accuracy. With the map, you can see, for example, Chair Kelly, you had mentioned Glass Pond, but Glass Pond is right there. It's much smaller at the time that Deborah prepared this report, published this report, but essentially lined right up on Route 20. It was perfect. And I think essentially you're going to see that the overall habit on the south side of the divide is everything is discharging to various tributary basins and ultimately leading to the south, southwest to Normanville. The same goes to the north. Essentially you can see that the groundwater divide is right here. Groundwater in this direction, the superficial sand aquifer, is headed to the Hudson River. Sand Creek is the primary tributary in that area. And then over here, the Lishakill and the Shaker Run, Shaker Creek, that area right here discharges to the Mohawk River. So essentially that provides us a good understanding of the conceptual water table contour, and we proved it out by comparing it with various published references and then the information that the towns and the county gave us along with their own research. And this was also a subtask to evaluate a specific area of the preserve. The orange reflects Willow Street area corridor, and if you can see, there's a tributary that's right here. It's a little small tributary, and then the Hunger Kill, the east branch of the Hunger Kill goes up through here like this, and the last pond's here in the west. It extends up this corridor right here, which is also underneath is where the Ballston Pre-Glacial Channel is. So essentially, I think that the critical point to demonstrate in this vicinity is that all the soils in this general area are consistent. If you look at a soil survey map, they all say excessively drained to well drained. It's called the Colony Loam Fine Sand. I'm a hydrogeologist and superficial geologist by breed. And I would call it it's not dune sand, it's lacustrine silty fine sand. And it drains very well. I live nearby, and it's a very consistent habit throughout the town. I would also say that that's the key thing, but if you go back and look at the superficial geologic map, you'll see that there's right here, you can see it. If you look at this area, we're looking right at this area. Glass Pond, as you can see from this map, is a little different than the presentation that Dr. Snavely provided. Because Glass Pond, when she did her studies, was only right here, and it grew to over here. But essentially, Willow Street is right here. Okay? And you can see that the finer lacustrine silty fine sands are on that corridor where the clear-cutting activity is on the Aeolian deposits. And all you have to do is look at Google or Bing, and you can see the areas, and it's very clear that this is a dune sand, because all you do is just go there and then look at possibly a development that's on the north side of the town of Colony, and it looks identical. So anyways, that's let me just sort of go back to our other presentation. But the key element here is that I wanted to demonstrate that we evaluated this for multiple lines of evidence to demonstrate if we build a conceptual water table contour map, what is the habit? And every resource we use, our own hydrogeologic work, showed the same effect. And you can see here that groundwater is flowing to the southwest to this tributary. And there's a little small tributary that goes from here. I don't know if you can see it on your hard copy, but there's a little snub right there. And actually, in reality now, it's moved a little this way towards the Kalanta Estate and Rose Hill area, I guess it's called. But you can see that the majority of this area, groundwater flow is in this direction, and then as it goes locally, it will go south and discharge to this tributary. Okay? The depth of water in this area is about 25 to 35 feet, and that proved out in the 3 models of the groundwater contour map we did. It showed consistently that. In general, that is consistent with that particular superficial geologic deposit on the entire area north of Route 20 and south of sort of the old state road corridor. So in that particular deposit. So I think there's a good amount of evidence as to what the research proved out as to what the overall habit. I think that in general, the groundwater flow pattern is to the south to southwest. There's a very nominal fraction that may go to the west. I think if water tables receive a lot of hurricane-related precipitation, for example, that this actual feature actually flattens out, and it's at the discharge point where it steepens. And so I think that the research we did is that I think we have a pretty solid handle on what the conditions are. Yes,
Mark, is there any evidence to suggest that there's static pressure or upward pressure on that water table periodically, or is it never?
No, because it's an unconfined system.
Okay.
I would say that if we had a better, more recent monitoring well network of the buried channel deposit, the one below it, that'd be interesting to see what the variability of that pressure is. But the answer is no relative to this unconfined superficial sand aquifer. I hesitate. I don't want to call it the pine bush aquifer because, you know, you talk to 3 of my kind and they'll tell you the pine bush aquifer is something different. And these reports bear that out. Okay. Any other questions associated with this particular area? Yes.
Could you remind me, so the houses that were having flooding problems on the southeast side of Willow Street, kind of, it's hard to tell from that photo. So the southeast side of that orange, like right in there.
Yep.
So are they on the west side of that line, or are there also some on the east side?
Some on the east side too.
On the east side, basically sandwiched there between the road.
My understanding is both.
Yes.
Is that sandy area that's shown the light color? That's the area that was restored habitat?
Yes.
This area right here?
Yep. And then see it goes down like a large L.
It's like a boomerang, right?
Yep, that's it. So that's all, as it goes up, that's white pine that was removed, and as it goes down, that was black locust that was previous.
And this area is referred to as Rose Hill in the town of Gilliland. The Kalanka estate, just for reference, is right here. You have Prospect Hill Cemetery, you have Willow Street, and you have the church there. Just so people want to know where this area is specifically. I think that if the hydrograph we have it, I wanted to talk about that early because keep in mind that that's on the eastern side of the Pine Bush area, and it doesn't necessarily correlate with the majority of the superficial sand aquifer because the average depth of water in that unit is greater than 20 feet, and you go into the northern half of it, it's typically 40 to 50 feet. And so I guess the concept is that you're going to see on a shallow system where the depth of water is very limited. I think if you have massive precipitation events like we experienced that year, that would be more sensitive, would fluctuate much more than something where the depth of water is much lower.
Can you go back to that hydrograph, Mark, to show them the different relief, the difference between the high period and the low period that we're in now?
Right, right. I mean, if you look at this area, this area is on SUNY Albany's property, I believe, close to Rensselaer Lake. And essentially, you can see that if this was the period where all the hurricanes were bludgeoning the Northeast, but you can see that the fluctuation here, we've seen some pretty dramatic change in precipitation trends in this area over this period. You've got a throw of about 5 feet. Okay. The point is that hydrographs on the central and western side of the Pine Bush area would not show as much of a throw because of the fact that the various processes would use the water before it would get to the water table. I'm not saying that it won't be 3, 4 feet, but it's not going to be 5, 6, 7 feet. And we've experienced this on other projects in this vicinity, especially in the western side of the building. And any other questions relative to that particular area? Okay. I want to close with just one last thought. I mentioned these buried channel deposits, and you can see it in the one map you have with you. And that is, you know where the Watervliet Reservoir is. This is the Route 20 corridor, and you can see the Mohawk Channel is right here. Okay. And then it actually goes down this way and goes and ultimately connects to the Hudson River. There's also another channel that's right here. It's called the Ballston Channel. And then there's also the Colony Channel, which is the one that most publications reference. This actually extends up through Clifton Park, up Glens Falls, the whole way. So, and they're very well known for their yield. So,
those are. I'm sorry, Mark, but those are ancient or pre-glacial riverbeds?
The actual channel was pre-glacial and then further scoured by the initial deposition after the tilt, the melt phase of various recessions before Glacial Lake Albany came. So this is the same. Those sands and gravels are the same sands and gravels of origin that you would find in the Great Flats Aquifer, which is over Schenectady, Scotia, Glenville area, where you have high energy sands and gravels, erratics, that are over 200 feet thick. And next to the aquifers that exist in Ohio, the aquifers representing this type of lithology are probably the most prolific in the state. But the origin, and there's been some carbon dating connecting the age of these buried ice contact sand and gravel deposits to the basal unit of what is found north of the Mohawk and Scotia Glenville. Very interesting. I don't want to take too much of your time. I want to entertain any questions or other elements that you think you would like addressed.
I just have a general question. You know, Neil, in your report on the technical committee, you have some general recommendations that you give for development projects like native plantings and all that. Do you also encourage porous pavement?
We have not been, but that's a trend in Albany that's growing. You know, the department and there's some consultants that are pushing it pretty heavy as a way to improve water infiltration in the ground.
Yeah. So I would just encourage you to think about that as one of your standard recommendations.
One of the things I'll mention is that one of our do-outs, along with the conceptual water table contour map, which again is for stewardship and understanding the asset, but also from an educational platform so that as a discovery center educates young kids and various folks.
Coalition had received a grant several years ago, and part of the grant is not only education, but is to generate a draft green infrastructure local laws that would help communities such as Gildan, Town of Colony, City of Albany, and Village of Colony employ green infrastructure practices such as open channel, stormwater management, porous pavement, as well as a couple other things to try to let the water go back down into the ground versus piping it and getting it to the streams as quickly as possible, which causes
Right.
erosion, flooding, and a host of other issues.
Yeah, I don't know how, we just did a porous pavement project as part of the New York Works program in Saratoga, in a pavilion area, and DOT, we've had trouble with the mix. You know, I don't know how sophisticated maybe these other communities are getting it right, but we had a lot of trouble working with DOT on a approvable mix for the asphalt. And when they finally put it in and got it right, they took a movie and had a lot of people from DOT come and check it out because it worked so well. It was sheet flowing across the parking lot, and then within about 12 inches of this new pavement, it was just gone.
Actually, in the town, we've actually done a test roadway using porous pavement as well. It's done a roadway at a standard 32-foot width, but also all the driveways. So you help.
Yeah.
And that's also in this, just outside the study area, but it's a common sense.
Yeah, it seems it's just so revolutionary, you know.
It eliminates the need for all these retention ponds
Yeah.
when you have excessively well-drained sand, and it reduces the area, the footprint of a proposed development project.
Yeah.
If they don't have to dig these ponds, and same like ours is out here that's always empty. It's a good project if you get it right.
Yeah.
Mike, if you're, I heard you say that Colony and other communities are developing some legislation on this. If you want to, we can help, I think, because we've just adopted a policy on green infrastructure at the department. So if you'd like us to share what we've got on that, we'd be happy to. It may be that you're going to go further than us, I'm not sure, but we do have a policy in place now.
I mean, a lot of our stuff is addressing the issues of the New York State stormwater prevention plan.
Yeah, we try to now incorporate that as a standard component of any kind of a major SWIFT development. That there's a green infrastructure component to it whenever possible.
And some of the porous pavement in this area, like the daughters of Sarah out in Albany, Washington Avenue Extension. Some of their porous pavement were constructed, the parking lots were constructed back in the mid-70s, and they're still functioning and working. It takes a little maintenance to keep it going, using the back truck and stuff like that, but they work very well.
Could you tell us what the acreage is that we're looking at as opposed to boundaries and Pine?
The acreage of the study area as a whole.
Right.
I'll have to get back to you on the specifics of that because we actually, it's actually our study area initially for purposes of creating a database is actually larger than what the slide shows. We actually collected information in order to gain a better understanding of the conceptual model. The southern end of Saratoga County all the way to the northern reaches of Bethlehem area, all the way to the western limits of Billbourne, Rotterdam, Schenectady.
Well,
so
I'm just looking ahead. If you're trying to teach kids about this, the black line there just doesn't fit.
Right. We essentially just tried to create some bounds for the study so that they could understand it. It was also some initial conversations we had with the commission on it, but I can get back to you with the specific as to the acreages of different elements. For example, how I would define the pine bush is everything that goes up to Glens Falls, because it is the same habitat, it is the same hydrogeology, and so it's important, especially when you're talking about the superficial sand. Obviously, the buried contact deposit doesn't exist everywhere, but you get my point. I can send that information to you. Thank you. In closing, I'd like to just mention my thanks to the Commission and demonstrate that we are willing partners to establish a monitoring plan to better understand the hydrogeology of the area. Right now, we want to make sure that after your annual plan has been approved and your budget's been approved, we can figure the best strategy going forward to protect and serve the Commission in the best way.
Thank you, Morris. Appreciate your
Thank you very much.
Our last agenda item today is a presentation on the Migratory Bird Project from Neil.
Good morning again. And we're going to shift a little bit from thinking about what's below the ground to what's flying above it. And I apologize, I just threw a couple of slides together and thought I'd wing it for this presentation. I've come before you before and talked a little bit about our bird work, but it's been receiving a lot of public attention. We're learning a lot from it, and there's a little bit to update. So I put together just a couple of slides, but I wanted to start with the whole context for this is that what we're learning about the birds, both breeding season and in the fall, is telling us obviously a lot, and the reason we're doing it is it's telling us a lot about our management, the impacts of our management for species that are of conservation concern locally, regionally, and nationally. But it's also building connections and relevance and perspective on our conservation work here to much broader and much larger conservation issues. And the cast of characters here are all the birds that visit. All these photos are from a volunteer, and I've got to mention Jane Tatlock. Jane is here just about every time we're banding. And in addition to taking all the data and managing all the data on a volunteer basis, Jane is also a phenomenal photographer and took these photos of black-throated blue warblers and black-pole warblers and northern perulas and Canada warblers, sharp-shinned hawk, ruby-throated hummingbird, that's a female, yellow-bellied flycatcher, which is a boreal bog bird, and then these three species of thrushes. You've got gray-cheeked thrush that breed way up in northern Canada, a hermit thrush that breed here and just north of us, and Swainson's thrush that breed in southern Canada, and a Tennessee warbler. So one of the things that we started off early on doing was trying to understand the breeding season biology and ecology of the birds in the preserve and figure out who are the best indicators for telling us about our management. And I presented this before. The prairie warbler came out on top, and the prairie warbler is a species of greatest conservation need not only in New York, but in all 13 of the northeastern states. It's a very charismatic bird. It's a bird that Audubon and through their important bird area and the New York State Bird Conservation Area, it's a bird that they're concerned about. The threshold for an IBA, for example, for Audubon is 17 pair of these birds, and we know in the preserve we have over 150 breeding pair a year. We're wrapping this project up. This has been relatively labor intensive, but we had some specific questions that we needed to answer about whether or not the pine bush and the habitat that we're managing is good for these guys and is actually providing them an opportunity to grow their population, or does the pine bush look nice but it's actually a sink? Birds check in but they don't check out because it's so urban and fragmented. Clearly, and we're going to work with our biologist Steve Campbell to publish this work, clearly the pine bush is a source. Reproduction far exceeds annual mortality, and I'll show you that now. So in four seasons, we've captured a total of 144 of these prairie warblers, and you can see the breakdown here by year, and males and females, and this year we had actually an unknown in that it was a hatching, it was a bird that just fledged the nest, and we couldn't tell if it was a male or a female. But 2012, our final year of doing this project and color banding these birds, we got 56 of them and put color bands on them. So a lot of them in the preserve, but this is really where the rubber meets the road from my mind as far as habitat. These birds are living a long time and coming back. Our annual recite rates, and if you look, so this is top line birds initially captured in 2009 that we were able to find in subsequent years, about 60% from 2009 to 2010, but then if you also look from 10 to 11, again above 50%, and from 11 to 12, 60%. The annual return rate on these guys is very high. The actual survival rate of these guys is actually even higher because there's no way we're finding every one that we put bands on. So those are phenomenal numbers. But then if you look at being our fourth season, we've got now 3 years worth of recapture data for 1 year out, for 2 years out. So 2 years after we initially caught a bird, we're looking at better than, well, both times, better than 30%, which is great. And we even this year had the first opportunity to catch birds that we initially abandoned 3 years ago, and it's around 10%. Those numbers are great, and the literature bears that out. So this is some of the stuff that we're working on publishing. And it's important not just to the preserve and the pine barrens, and these guys, again, are the best bird indicator of high quality barrens, but also because it's a species of greatest conservation need, it's a species that New York State DEC is interested in. I just last week finished reviewing the species status report. I was asked to kind of give it a professional peer review and look at what the department is thinking about this bird moving forward. Because we have not only some of the best habitat, but some of the highest populations of this bird in upstate New York. So prairie welders are telling us a lot. And again, this has been really labor intensive. We're going out and targeting these birds on their territories, catching them, trying to follow them, map their territories, find females, find nests. There's actually an easier way to get more information about the whole breeding season bird community. And we piloted this project this year. And this is setting up a map station and monitoring avian productivity and survivorship. These are it's a continent-wide network, Canada and Mexico, organized and managed in combination by the Institute for Bird Populations out of California, but also in cooperation with the USGS that provided me with my bird banding permit. One of the conditions of them giving me that permit is that we establish one of these map stations. These are permanent throughout the breeding season. We set up nets, and hopefully you can see that in this bottom slide. You can at least see the pole. It's good that the nets are largely invisible. That's how we catch the birds. But during the breeding season, once the spring migrants have gone, once every 10 days for about 7 weeks, we would set up 12 of these nets and run them. And so we piloted this project this year in Corner Barrens West and Kings Road Barrens. We set up 12 nets around approximately 20-acre area, and then capture birds all morning and process them. You can see the whole team here. Dylan is there processing a bird. Throw a table and all of our equipment in the back of a truck and set up. This is in Corner Barrens West. We also did this in Kings Road Barrens. And it allows you to, at the beginning of the season, of course, you're catching adult birds. So you can catch them and know how to age them based on their plumage. So we're looking at age and sex information. Is it a bird that's more than 2 years old? Is it a bird that hatched last year? Are the kinds of things we can tell. And then the species. And then we do that throughout the season. And as the season progresses, of course, you start catching, hopefully, you start catching a lot of young birds that left the nest that season. And by doing that over time, it's going to tell us a lot about the whole breeding season bird community here, which is relevant to our management. But also, it's directly feeding into the master database that the USGS houses for all the birds that are banded in North America, and to IBP's work, where they're looking at and processing all of these, about 500-600 stations across the continent. So all the work that we're doing here and the management that we're doing is benefiting these birds, and the science that we're doing is benefiting us to help us understand the impacts that we're having, but also tying us into a larger conservation initiative, because birds, especially birds of early successional habitats, are in real trouble, not just in the pine bush, not just in New York State, not just in the Northeast, but nationwide. There's just a lot less of the early successional open sunny habitats that certain species need. Not all species need closed canopy forests. And we picked up some surprises this year. So here's an orchard oriole. I've been an avid birder since I was a kid. And I've been working here for what, 15, almost 16 years, and I had never seen orchard orioles in the preserve, didn't know they were here. And we caught males and females, young and old birds in Corner Barrens West this year. This is North America's smallest oriole. And it sounds similar to a Baltimore, but different enough. But we had never identified it in our auditory survey. So that was a nice surprise. And then it's always fun to see other birds like eastern bluebirds. And we caught lots of prairie warblers as well. Brown thrashers, the whole suite. So we piloted this project this year to understand the methods, the data sheets, record keeping, all of that. It's pretty intense as far as the record keeping and managing the data. But we've got it figured out, and now we will be officially part of this network starting in June of 2013. And we picked up a couple of surprises this year during the breeding season. So one of the things we're looking for, of course, is birds that we caught here, and if they're surviving, we'll catch birds that have bands on them. And typically we've only been at this a couple of years. When we catch birds with a band, we almost always assume it's ours, especially for species that are common here, like field sparrows and cedar waxwings. But when you put the data in, and when you submit it to the lab, they instantly send you a message if it's a foreign recapture, if it's a bird that was actually banded someplace else. We had 2 this year, and talking with DEC and their map station that they run over at 5 Rivers, in all of the years that they've been doing this, they've only had a couple of foreign recaptures. So for us in our first year of breeding season banding, to catch birds that were initially caught elsewhere is kind of impressive. This field sparrow was banded last fall as a hatchier bird, so it hatched last year. It was caught last fall, probably on migration in northern Jersey. So she probably was hatched in the preserve and was picked up by a bander in Jersey on her way south. Came back to the preserve this summer, we recaught her. That story isn't all that surprising. We don't know where she ended up, but she at least went about 180 miles. But this cedar waxwing was banded in 2010, in the middle of the summer, 2 years ago, as an adult bird. When we banded it, we caught it this year in the preserve in July, in the middle of the breeding season. And these guys are nomads. Cedar waxwings move around a lot, and I was doing my homework before this morning's presentation. There's a lot that we don't know about the movements of these birds and how they move in response to berry production in particular. So I don't know why he came from here to the pine bush, but that's over 300 miles that bird traveled over the last couple of years. So it's neat right away, these kinds of connections begin tying us into the larger conservation picture of bird conservation in the Northeast. But also, of course, our fall migrant work really ties us in globally. Birds move across the continent, flying south every fall. And I wanted to show you a couple of really interesting videos. This is from movebank.org. These are all satellite trackers on various species of birds. If you remember Roland Case from the New York State Museum, he's put this together. But it shows the pathways that some birds use. And down the lower left, you can see the ticker of the months and dates. So springtime, snow's melting, all these species are moving north. Some faster than others, depending on where they go. And he's continuing to build this database as they get more and more birds with satellite trackers on them. And then, of course, the breeding season, July and August, things start moving south again. But seeing some of these movements, there's a lot of movement along the eastern seaboard, along the east coast. We just kind of build some perspective on, we're an important staging area for birds traveling thousands of miles twice a year. And a lot of, we know from other published work that we've done here, that a lot of these birds are coming from very, very far away. We've got black-poll warblers, for example, visiting the preserve that originated in the Yukon. So that's one part of the puzzle. But the second, and I think more interesting concept that ties us together is how many birds are in the sky at night during the fall. All of these blue circles are Doppler radar stations picking up birds. The green is weather. The sun just set, birds migrate at night. You can see the limits of the Doppler radar by the circles. The sky is literally full of birds migrating in the fall. All of this blue cloudiness you see are birds migrating at night relative to where we are. Again, I just show you this to kind of reinforce the idea there's a lot of activity and a lot of birds moving through. There's a ton of fragmentation, light pollution, limited places for birds to find appropriate habitat to refuel. And if they can't gain the energy to make it all the way south, they're not going to make it. So just reinforces and builds those larger connections. And that was all work that we started, of course, with Dr. Kirkman from the New York State Museum. And this, I'm not going to get into the numbers a lot. To date, through our fall banding, this was our 6th year, we've banded over 1,000 birds from 70 species, and of those, about 500, almost 600 of them were true migrants in the fall from close to 50 species. And every year we continue to catch new species. We look through the numbers. Each year we're adding almost a dozen species. So the longer we do this, the more we're finding. So clearly birds are helping us understand the preserve, the biology of the preserve. And we spent a lot of time figuring out what carnaby butterflies need, what do we think the appropriate vegetation is what the preserve is going to look like. But ultimately, in my mind, it's not only carners, but it's all of the wildlife that will ultimately tell us if we're building a viable preserve or not. If the habitat is truly viable, it's not just going to look nice to us, but it's actually going to be productive habitat for the wildlife that call this place home. But clearly birds are helping tie the preserve to state, regional, national, and international conservation priorities. We talked about that there's our own management plans, there's the New York State DEC's comprehensive wildlife conservation strategy, the state wildlife plan, if you will. The whole idea behind that plan is that identify the species that are rare and try and help them before they need to be listed. Every state in the union has one of those plans, and it's turning out that the bird community of the pine bush and the birds that are here, as an example, are a lot of the species that we have in the preserve are directly tied to that plan. So we have state priorities, but also regional and nationally. The Partners in Flight's National Bird Conservation Plan highlights early successful habitats and highlights the need to protect breeding sites, but also important migratory staging areas. And it's clear that the preserve is providing habitat for those birds. But ultimately, I think more than any other species of wildlife or group of wildlife that we have in the preserve, birds are accessible. A lot of people still walk in the door and say, I've been coming to the pine bush for years, and I hear coners are doing better, but I've never seen one. I dare you to challenge any of them to step outside the door for 5 minutes and tell me that they didn't see a bird. Birds are incredibly accessible. People like birds. And what we're learning about the birds and our impacts, the birds provide us a window on the impacts of our conservation that can, one, inform and educate, but also entertain preserve visitors. Folks spend, looking through the national numbers, folks spend more money and more people spend money on wildlife watching, and particularly bird watching, than almost any other outdoor recreational activity. So I think in combination with all the work we're doing at Carnes, all of this bird work is clearly helping bridge a gap with the public and the public's responding. I recently provided a presentation for the Friends group and was surprised. It's the first time I've ever given a presentation on behalf of the commission where we had to go get more chairs. So it was very well attended. So in all, I think we're learning a lot from the birds, but they're also helping us bridge the gap and engage the public in a way that we really haven't been able to do before. That's kind of all I had prepared, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and entertain them.
You talked a lot at the outset about the prairie warbler. Is that species, or are there other species that you consider sort of like a sentinel? How effective the conservation is at achieving?
Yes, to answer your question, and specifically for pitch pine scrub oak barrens. It's one of the early papers that Jason and I put together. There's a suite of about 6 species. There's prairie warblers, brown thrashers, eastern towhees, field sparrows, and kingbirds, I believe, is the other one. So there's a small subset that we really need to pay attention to that are good sentinels and good indicators. And then of those 6, the prairie was the best.
The other question I had is so many of the photos involve the bird perched on your hand.
Yes.
I'm always wondering how you managed to pull that off.
With these?
No,
it's not easy.
Any wild bird, I would think they'd fight to get away, right?
They do, but once they realize that you have them,
yeah,
and you're holding their legs between your fingers,
yeah,
they'll just sit there. So, some of them, and Dylan can attest to this, some of them do flop like crazy. You can't hold them in that photographer's grip to get a decent picture because they won't hold still. Most birds will hold still, at least long enough to get a photograph.
What about the pine warbler?
Mike?
What about the pine warbler?
Pine warbler?
Yeah, I wouldn't put that in the group you're talking about.
Well, no, they depend on pitch pine and particularly tall trees. They're here. We know their population has grown.
I would have thought they would have been another one of the really good indicators.
No, because they'll breed in white pine, red pine, and they're not a good indicator partly because they're incredibly difficult to detect. Because a pine warbler, we don't catch them in the nets because they're flying way too high. Yeah. And they sound, you got a junco, chipping sparrow, and pine warbler all sound alike, even to many of us this summer and doing our sampling.
Right. So I wasn't taking logistics into consideration.
Right.
Okay.
And they aren't really dependent on that shrubland community, that open barrens community.
I thought they were, okay.
But they are doing better here than they were 20, 30 years ago. Mike?
I noticed on your the rebanding or recatching
yes.
for like the prairie warbler.
you know, once you got to like 4 years, they go down to 10% or something like that.
Right.
What's the average life expectancy of these birds?
5, 6 years.
Just 5, 6 years. I mean, 'cause
Yeah.
they are very tiny.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned this, most of the mortality happens first year during fall migration. Yep. Migration is incredibly physiologically expensive for them, and they're vulnerable to predation and to weather. Which is why you need good habitats producing lots of young birds to get those kinds of return rates. Well, thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Okay, our final thing is to consider future meetings, and we meet again not till the spring, March 21st. So I just want to say I hope everyone has a great holiday season, and may we all survive the Mayan end of days. Oh, we need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Okay. All in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say nay. Okay. We are adjourned. Thank you.